welcome to the first panel of the afternoon. This is going to be business nuances and legal challenges in eSports. You might remember me from the entire morning. My name is Ross Hersemann. I work at voting law, and I'm an adjunct professor of video game law over at DePaul University. I work mostly with independent game developers and help them do everything from their business incorporations to their trademarks, copyrights, nastygrams, and contracts.
What's a nastygram?
Nastygram? Those are those cool letters we send out that tell people to stop doing things or else.
I love those.
My favorite. So tell the people who you are and what you do, Jason.
Sure. Hi, my name is Jason Greenglass. I think a recovering attorney. Recently moved away from the practice of law. I'm now the executive vice president of Evolved's talent agency. It's a talent agency that exclusively represents players in the esports space, the professional esports athletes. We also have a large, pool of talent that we represent in the Twitch streaming capacity, YouTube content creators, influencers on Instagram, cosplay, individuals, you name it. So we're kind of first to market in a way for being an agency to represent the newfound business and passion that makes up the blood of what is esports and sort of the cottage industries that pop up around that. So having worked on a good couple hundred of esport documents, whether it's contracts for players to make sure that they understand their rights and to advocate on their behalf when signing with a professional organization, to sending nastygrams on behalf of players for people that aren't paying them. That's been my experience in the legal world, but it's definitely shifted more so to the agency side, the transactional and the business world now that I'm shifted over and a recovering attorney.
Hi, my name is Wil Bucher. I am still an attorney, so I've yet to take the first step. I practice at Debevoise in Plimpton, which is a large law firm in New York. We work mostly with publishers. We also do some hardware work. Our work for them is mostly mergers and acquisitions, so helping them buy other companies. And then we also do a lot of IP litigation for them, so copyright, trademark, rights, publicity. We don't do patent work, but we do soft IP work for large publishers in the video game space. And specifically today, you'll notice that the presentation title is The Nuances of the Legal Issues in Esports. So sadly, I'm here to talk about the nuances. So we've done a lot of work working with the FTC on disclosure requirements for non-traditional marketing. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit later in this presentation about how that affects esports. And we'll kind of discuss the open questions that raises for how an esports franchise needs to conduct its business.
Yeah, I think also just to keep in your minds, just to kind of process how we're going to go through this, there's going to be a lot of, hopefully, conversation and dialogue between really all of us, as esports in general is an open question for interpretation for a lot of these larger issues.
Right, so what I've just put up on the slide right now is a selection of talking points that we're going to be covering today. It's kind of serving as a roadmap. We're going to stick to this as closely as we can, but we're also encouraging you to bring your burning questions to us, because I think that's what we enjoy talking about the most. But the first thing that we always come to when we're talking about esports is, why do they matter? I know that you've probably all encountered this in your practices as well, but when we're talking to folks who aren't specifically gamers, they might not know what esports are. They might not even be able to name some of the most popular games, despite the fact that they draw greater attendance than the Super Bowl or NBA Finals. After that, we're going to get into some streaming rights, talking about the legal and business implications of what actually goes into streaming video games live on network television or on video or on systems like Twitch or online streaming. And we're just going to kind of fold that into some of the business aspects of esports. We're going to get into some sponsorships, how teams kind of finance what they do, how financial sponsorships influence contracts, and how esports players actually interact with each other and other teams, and how they actually earn their living. And then we're going to jump into some regulation and licensing issues as well. So Jason, can you just kind of lay a groundwork for us about how esports function, how they're what are esports? Give me explain like I'm five.
Sure. So I'm trying to come up with a witty joke here, and I'm just going to stop. All right. So esports in general can be looked at in a number of different ways. I think real briefly, there's online events and there's offline events. The way to think about it in a best sort of case scenario for if you're the uninitiated is that an offline event would be a physical event. It'd be at a stadium. The LA Staples Center has sold out. There's the World Cup soccer stadium in Seoul, South Korea has sold out. The Madison Square Garden has sold out multiple days. There's stadiums that ESL uses. I can't remember its name right now, but it sells out for the CSGO tournament that happens in Cologne every year, ESL 1, I believe it's called. So these offline events can have thousands of people, multiple thousands of people over a span of a couple of days going to a stadium to watch a video game get played in a competitive setting between two teams. So there's the online component as well. And the online component of an esport is, I guess, where the vast majority of participants are really involved, which is when you are watching a game on Twitch, which is a platform, for those that you don't know, it's a streaming platform that was acquired by Amazon for almost $1 billion, like 900 million. There's hundreds of thousands of people that will tune in every day to watch the same stream, whether it's the professional play, so the games like the weekly games that aren't going to be in stadiums are streamed each week on Twitch, and hundreds of thousands of people tune in concurrently, with millions of people that watch over the course of a month. But the player base of these games also take place online. So a lot of the practice that the teams do is online. A lot of the competition will be online, certainly in the amateur scenes or the challenger scenes. And there's even some tournaments that are held in an online capacity. So esports really has this duality to it. Really, it's are you online or are you offline, and in what capacity are you in which? But I think there's a greater nuance here to really defining what an esport is, and I don't think that there's a magic bullet that says that if you hit the following notes, you're an esport. Esports is very much defined from a bottoms up capacity. I don't think there's no model currently, I think, that can really be followed from a top down that says we are making this an esport. This is going to be an esport. We are designing this game to be an esport, and it's going to be defined by the publisher or the developer from the outset that it's an esport, and then it just succeeds. I think any game that has currently become an esport has been defined as such by its community that participates in it, the competition that has defined the existence of that game that gives it legs. So it's very much a sort of grassroots community-driven experience that requires an engagement from the top level with sort of the core component of the people that are seeking this out as a competitive venture, and then enabling that bottom-up capacity to fuel the endeavor. So when you think about the Season 1 finals for League of Legends that were held at DreamHack, the League of Legends Riot Games put on a Season 1 finals. For a lot of the teams at the time, they weren't very professionally organized, but you had Team Solo Mid, you had CLG, which is Counter Logic Gaming, and there were teams popping up around the world, and they said, why don't we just give a chance for these teams that seem like they're really committed to our game to participate? And they had way more viewership than they expected they would have, and they said, wow, there could be really something here. So enabling that bottom up to sort of feed it has sort of really funneled the growth of what League of Legends has evolved into organically over time. So let's talk about why esports matter. Last year we had a question of, is esports real? Is it going to stay? What's the value of esports? Well, we have a better picture of what the value of esports is. And in fact, the value of esports is continuing to trend upwards. Over the last few years, we've seen esports generate a tremendous amount of revenue globally. We also see that there's a tremendous amount of growth internationally for this. So it's not just North America. Although North America, I think, makes up probably, if I can read that slide from here, like 38% in 2016. But there's a huge chunk of the market that is also going to China and South Korea. In fact, Riot Games, the controlling shares of Riot Games as the publisher-developer of the game is owned by Tencent, which is a Chinese organization. And there's been a tremendous investment in the infrastructure, both for their servers and for the logistics of even just having a professional e-sport in China that Tencent has backed to kind of give it that strength to thrive in China. So moving forwards, we're looking at, by 2019, esports there's going to be a lot of money in esports. And that's why these questions should matter. That's why when you are asking, should we make a component of our game that has maybe a competitive aspect to it or an esport competitive component, Well, this is why it matters, because there's a lot of money that's moving here, and there's a lot of money that people are going to say, like, wow, let's just see if we can make this work. But esports should be something more than just throwing money into the abyss and hoping that it flies back out at you. Look at, for example, The Witcher 3 with CD Projekt Red. They made this trilogy of games that were expansive in a mythology that North American audiences had yet to really be introduced to. They're fantastically vivid role-playing games. There's no competitive component to that game whatsoever. CD Projekt Red just happened to step into serendipity by making a small little side game in Witcher 3 called Gwent. And it's this tiny card game that you can play, vendors and innkeepers and shop salesmen in a card game. Sometimes you bet money, maybe you can win a card from them. This seemed to hit a vein with a competitive card-playing gaming audience. So CD Projekt Red said, wow, you guys really like this. Sure, let's go ahead and make a standalone game for this. And they just had a Challenger Series event for it where players were invited from all over the world to compete for a $100,000 prize pool for this standalone card game called Gwent. And it's an example of how a developer and a publisher with the right kind of agility and understanding your core audience and understanding what people are interested in can bring legs to your IP that you might otherwise have not been thinking about. So if you're developing a game that's in a non-esports space, maybe there's a component to it that's going to matter, and this is a market and a vein that you can tap into. So it's going to have it currently does, and it will moving forwards have a much larger impact on sort of, I think, games development in the future. So looking at esports in the United States is more of like a larger breakdown. I don't suppose we can pull the laptop a little closer.
We have the technology.
Aha, excellent.
We can do it.
Awesome. These old eyes aren't what they used to be. All right. So just kind of walking through some of the numbers here, the percentage of online populations in the esports audience. So the total esports audience, as we can sort of softball these figures, is about 41.7 million people. 20 million of them are esports enthusiasts. But the numbers that Riot Games has released for the amount of people that play League of Legends, sometimes they give a bit of a lapse in years. They don't give out current information every year, but the last sort of hard numbers we were given was there was about 1% of the world's population plays League of Legends, which is about 70 million people. Although concurrent monthly users, people use it like every day, that number drops dramatically. People that use it every month, the number goes up. But there's a lot of people that play the game around the world. And that's just League of Legends. That's not including Dota 2. That's not including Counter-Strike Go, Hearthstone, any of the fighting games that are out there, or even, arguably speaking, speedrunning. So if you are making a game, if you're a dev and you have like this crazy game that you want to play or make, you might be making the next Super Meat Boy that you're trying to sort of strike gold with. But Super Meat Boy has had much longer legs in the market, not just for being a great game, but because people now speedrun it and try to go for like world records. And it's not an esport per se, but there's a competitive aspect to the speedrunning community that has brought greater longevity and life to the IP of that game that otherwise may not have existed. So you look at esports in the United States, and the audience skews predominantly male. It's definitely going to be in the 21 to 35 demographic, but I think from as far as audiences are concerned, it's going to skew vastly towards the 18 to 24. The percentage of individuals that are active in team sports versus the online participation, I think a lot of people are more in team sports. We have a system in the U.S., at least in North America, where you can go to Little League, or you can go to youth soccer, or you could go to a basketball program in your school. We've integrated into our education system. So the experience that most children have adopting team play and what it means to have, companionship and all of these like high valued ideas of competition, of perseverance and understanding the role that coaches bring and recognizing authority, all of that's built into our traditional sports models, but we don't have that in esports. So, of course, these numbers are going to skew more in favor of the traditional sports model to have more kids be involved in traditional sports than they are in esports, but we're seeing a very, very quick transition with the younger age demographics to be involved in esports, whether it's like a pickup thing with their friends. High schools are now adopting League of Legends programs. Robert Morris University, which is right down the street here, was the first program in North America to offer athletic scholarships for students to go to college to play eSports. And I've coached there for the last 3 years. I've coached a number of programs within their eSports program, but we've had for the last 2 years a high school invitational where we've invited high schools out to Robert Morris and have their program sort of compete. So you're seeing a growing trend to incorporate it within education systems to allow children and young adults to kind of grow and adapt and bring in this maturity that esports is working towards. Let's talk about some of the audience numbers here. The time spent watching esports vastly outscales the audience number. So in 2012, and this graph comes courtesy of ESPN, and the previous ones come courtesy of Newzoo. But in 2012, about 58 million people watched it, but the amount of hours they spent watching it was like 1.3 billion. That number vastly changes in 2013 and then grows even more in 2014. So the amount of people that are interested in watching these games, watching the competition, and participating as a maybe passive observer of it, it's a very compelling argument to say why esports should matter, because when you start getting into some of the legal nuances about the things you need to be careful of when you start entering this space, if you're going to be doing, say, sponsorships, or if you're going to be talking about employment issues, there's a lot of money moving here, and there's a lot of people that are interested in the business aspect of this because it is so big. And then here's sort of the demographics of esports fans in 2014. This is, I think, probably needs to be updated just because in the last couple of years we've seen this skew closer to the 18 to 24 than we've seen at 21 to 35. But there's something to be said about the esports audience in terms of its demographic tends to be a little bit more mature, but there's a level of accessibility for the younger kids. You talk to anybody who has kids who are like 10 to 12 to 14, and all they're doing is watching things on their computer. They're watching YouTube or they're watching esports. They're not watching baseball. In fact, I was on a panel in LA a couple weeks ago, and one of the owners of the professional organization, it's called Immortals, one of their owners, Clinton Foy, was talking about a conversation he had with the owner of the LA Dodgers. And the demographics for baseball are skewing into like 55 years of age. And it's only getting older. People aren't taking their kids to baseball games anymore. So in 5 to 10 years, you have a demographic ticking time bomb for baseball where they're just going to have like the generational issue as people begin to sort of, it's going to be blunt to say it, but as people begin to die, you're not replacing that audience for that source of entertainment because they're going somewhere else. So if you have a ticking time bomb like in baseball, but you're seeing the audience for esports, it's going the opposite direction. You're getting younger and younger and people involved, and people are actually persisting with it. There's something to be said about that. There is something here that has the legs to grow that's worth kind of the investment. It's not like the audience is getting older and then not engaging as they just go on and move on with their life. So let's talk about sponsorships here for a little bit. This is a traditional sports sponsorship idea. We all look at this and we see this is normal. You go to a baseball stadium and they're called Progressive Field. They're called the United Center. Right? They're named after sponsors. Comiskey Park is no longer in existence and hasn't been for a long time. But this is a common sight to see in most traditional sports. How does that look like in esports? What are sponsorships looking like in esports? And by comparison, this is what sponsors look like in esports. So this is an event that ESL puts on. They'll be putting on ESL 1 in Cologne. They'll be putting on tournaments at ESL New York, where they have CSGO is a massively popular first-person shooter, and they partner up with what we call endemic brands. Endemic is to the gaming or the computer, market, PC market. So you would have BenQ for monitors, Asus for computer parts, Intel clearly, Sony, Cooler Master, NVIDIA, but then you also kind of go into the peripheral markets. So you have, Razer for headsets and mice and keyboards. Then you have the publishers, the developers of games, so Activision, Blizzard, EA, Wargaming, or Riot Games. So note how there's very few sponsors here that are Bud Light, Toyota, Delta, Dunkin' Donuts, Hertz. So there's a clear distinction between the type of business that's going to be investing sponsorship-wise and seeing the value in what these numbers mean or what this growth looks like, and having a dialogue with these traditional sponsors, helping them to understand what this means. You know, when someone says, wait, you watch someone else play a video game on the computer, like you're not playing it yourself, having that someone ask that question is literally showing you how someone 100 years ago was asking that question about football. Wait, you watch someone else play football? Well, yeah, and now it's not such a crazy thing to ask. So this is the challenge that's presented in esports right now of how are the broadcasting rights for the games being shared? Who has a right to that revenue? Where is that revenue coming from? And then when you're talking about sponsorships, are these sponsorships going to be for the organizations that are signing these players? To what extent do you have a player get an individual sponsorship? And that's something that we work on very closely at Evolve Talent, where we try to educate our talent on what sponsors are going to be interested, where the right place to target is, and what those sponsors are looking for, and how to activate those brands in that space. Because this is a very passive type of sponsorship, to have Bud Light just sit there, Budweiser, have Hertz there. I mean, from a poll of the room, how many of you are going to go to a baseball game, see a Hertz ad there, and then be inclined to go get Hertz as your next rental car? Not a lot of you.
Absolutely zero.
Right.
Right. Although I guess I'll jump in there and say I think we're seeing a transition to traditional advertising. Axe and Nissan now have League of Legends teams, and the point of the Hertz ad isn't that you're going to go buy a Hertz. Most non-endemic advertising, the idea is to remind you that that product exists, and you're not drinking a Bud Light because you see the Bud Light ad. You're drinking a Bud Light because you see the ad and you're like, oh yeah, I guess I do want to be, or I guess I do enjoy drinking Bud Light, and then you drink it later. And I think we'll see that evolve. But you're absolutely right. What we're seeing right now is mostly endemic advertising. That's related in some tangential way to the games themselves.
And
Well, my question is, what does this actually look like in esports and for esports players? Is it something as simple as people playing games are using a particular brand of technology or drinking a particular energy drink, and people see it on a stream and then go, oh, they're endorsed by that company?
yeah, that's absolutely.
Or is it even something like closer to NASCAR where people are wearing uniforms that have patches and logos?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's both. To be honest, the answer to the question is both. You have sort of what we call traditional lifestyle promotions or marketing. And I think there's a great question that kind of comes up between our points here, which is that's a question on marketing, what's going to be effective use of your marketing budget, and is there value to that? And obviously Hertz and Budweiser, Toyota have found a value here in the same way that Adidas has found a value being in here, or Red Bull. But when an individual player or Twitch streamer is on their stream and there's a monster cooler in the background and then they're not interacting with it, it's just sitting there. I think that's a very similar argument to just having
Right. No, I
Hertz
think it's very similar
on
to the Hertz logo.
Yeah, on the scoreboard.
Although, as we'll discuss shortly, I'm not sure the FTC thinks so.
Well, yeah, and we will go into that certainly.
Right.
But to the extent that a player is using a branded headset, a HyperX headset, and does a pre-roll that says, this video is supported and brought to you by HyperX. I've got a great relationship with them, and they're helping me be able to have the career that I want to have. And I really, really like their headset. It helps me hear things better. We can get into the whole legal and business discussion of what that sponsorship looks like. But there's that component to it where they're actively using it on their own. And sometimes maybe they're not actively showing people, but it's listed in their description. Below any stream or YouTube homepage, you have the option to have kind of like a bio. And that bio could say, well, this is my rig specifics. This is what my computer is built out of. This is what my keyboard is. And if somebody really is a fanatic and has a fan of whoever this person is, or they idolize them and they want to say, I want to be as good as this person, they'll want to get similar stuff. I mean, they'll want the free box with the pumps in it because they think it's going to help them play better.
Sure.
But there's teams will often have patches on their jerseys that they wear. And that's very similar to the NASCAR effect.
So it sounds like it's risen to that level where people watching esports have an expectation that esports players might be endorsed, and that if they're using a particular product, does that mean that they're probably more likely than not endorsed by that product, or is there some kind of give and take between the two?
I think that if a team has a jersey and the jersey has a logo on it, then yeah, I think it's very clear they're endorsed by them. I think it's very clear that like that's, I mean, to the extent that like, so SKT1 is a team in League of Legends, and their actual team name is Samsung SKT1, which is Samsung Telecom, and it's the team is actually owned by Samsung. It's just a marketing branch of Samsung, and they see this as an opportunity to get Samsung's name out there, and it has been remarkably successful for them. Now, we look at League of Legends here in North America, and a team might be called Immortals or TSM or CLG. There's no ownership by a major company and looking at this as a marketing opportunity. So what TSM or CLG is doing is they will court, or presumably companies might court them, to enter a relationship with their sponsorship where they can leverage that existing community that's watching these games and say, hey, we can put you in front of a lot of eyeballs, you should sponsor us. Or maybe a company might say, well, we want to sponsor you, and what would that look like to be able to do that? So I think from a professional high-level conversation, the organizational aspect of it, I think most people who watch it are going to say that team is sponsored because they can see the branding on it. Mm-hmm. But on an individual level, when you're looking at a YouTube streamer or a Twitch streamer, there's probably an open question about whether or not people understand if they are sponsored. Although there's usually some kind of discussion about like who supports them, or they're thanking their sponsors somewhere there. But every video doesn't start with I think hey, I'm sponsored by this, so this is a paid ad. There's I think that's
sure. No, I mean, I think it's time to move into. Here we go. Here, I'll be the master of the. So, this is a legal program. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the FTC. So the FTC recently has kind of gone on a crusade against what they believe is misleading, non-traditional marketing. So think about paying somebody to make a tweet for you, paying someone to create a YouTube video, giving someone a free game, and they go on a live stream. That's a topic that you could talk about for a full hour. I've done CLEs where I've talked about it for a full hour. But for the purpose of esports, I wanted to give you guys a brief introduction to sort of what the FTC is saying, and then we'll get into how that affects the sponsorships that esports teams depend on to support basically the entire ecosystem. So I'll start with what's the core rule. And the FTC is in their endorsement guides, which they released a couple years ago, said that if there's a connection between an endorser and the marketer that the consumers would not expect, and that would affect how consumers would view that endorsement, then the connection needs to be fully disclosed. I have the fully there in brackets. The actual rule just says disclosed, but in practice, the FTC is very particular about how they want the disclosure to be, and in fact often asks for any evidence you have that people actually see the disclaimer or read the bio on the page. So to give you a sense of what that looks like, they went after Warner Brothers and PewDiePie for the creation of a video. So this is the video page. I've had to do a double call out here. So PewDiePie was paid to play Shadow of Mordor, and to do so in a positive light to promote Warner Brothers' game. When he did that, in his little bio, if you click the Show More button, you got what's basically the right half of the screen there. And there was this huge block of text. He's covered up by the call out, but there's a little bro fist in the text. But in that text, he said this video was sponsored by Warner Brother. Actually misspelled the name of the company that was hiring him. But this was text you saw if you click the Show More button within YouTube. When he started his video, he said he had the opportunity to check out the Gamescom demo of this game. Didn't mention that he got in the game for free or was paid $10,000 to create the video. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the FTC had a bunch of problems with this video. So when they ultimately signed a consent decree with Warner Brothers, they made clear what they thought the issues were. So the first issue they mentioned, which we've seen in a lot of FTC enforcement actions, is that when you disclose you're sponsoring something, if it's not obvious to the consumer, the FTC really wants that disclosure to be what they call above the fold. That means when you see the medium, you don't have to click any additional buttons to see that disclosure. So in this case, although there was a disclosure in the bio, you couldn't see that unless you click the See More button to read beyond the first 3 lines. And the FTC said, look, 99% of YouTube viewers aren't going to click that button, so they're going to have no idea. They went even beyond that, though. They talked about how to disclose. And the FTC is really big on disclosing in the same manner as the sponsorship. So if it's a tweet, that needs to be characters within the tweet. That can't be a bio you go to. in the context of a video with audio content, that means an audio disclosure. And they kind of explicitly have a preference for you saying in the video itself that the content is sponsored. For fixed length video like YouTube, that can be pretty simple. At the beginning of the video, you say, hey, I just want to let you know Warner Brothers sponsored this video. I'm going to go into it. Just saying thanks is not enough. The FTC has said that if you just thank the company, but don't mention that it was sponsored or that you were paid, that's not clear that you're receiving an endorsement. I'm not sure that's true as a factual matter, but that's the position the FTC is taking, and thus, for the lawyers in the room, that's the position we need to advise our clients, and for the developers in the room, that's the position you need to adopt in order to not have the FTC come after you.
And on that note, it's just a matter of practice for my own personal business experience, we have to conflict check with some of our talent, because if, say, we have a computer manufacturer that wants to sponsor an individual talent and all they're doing on their bio is thanking a wholesaler for helping like their rig, I have no idea if there's an existing relationship between them. I have to go directly to my talent and ask them, because it doesn't say it quite clearly on that if I'm using that alone and I'm actually doing work for them. So,
Right.
So Will,
I think there's something to be said about that.
Is the FTC sensitive to any kind of industry nuance here? Where are they taking into account the fact that most YouTubers are not lawyers and they might not make that kind of distinction between above the fold or
Sure.
behind the
So I
click,
would.
as the case may be?
The experience I've had is that the FTC is sensitive to nuance when it helps their position and not sensitive when it doesn't. So they are very quick to say, some people on YouTube are 12. You got to make it really clear because a 12-year-old's not going to understand. But then when you mention, hey, the average IQ of an eSports viewer is, 10 points higher than the national average. These are really smart people watching it. They're like, we don't believe that. So there's not, they like to use nuance when it helps them. You may, I don't know, for those of you who do this sort of work, YouTube has recently added a feature that allows you to do a call out at the beginning of the video that says that it's sponsored. FTC doesn't like that. FTC says that's not enough. Their issue with it is it says that some of the products in the video may be sponsored, but it doesn't specify what's sponsored, how it was sponsored, and they don't like the fact that it's not an audio. They really want to see audio and audio content. On the question of nuance, I think that really misses the nuance that a lot of people will watch videos on their phone, like on the bus, where they won't be playing the sound. They'll be in a public place where it would be rude to play the sound, and I think the text-based disclosure is actually better in that sense, but that's not the position the FTC has taken. The one small bit of ground the FTC has given is that you don't need to disclose the amount of the sponsorship. So PewDiePie needs to say that he was paid to do the video, doesn't need to say he was paid $10,000 or whatever outrageous rate he's charging now 2 years later. The FTC in the last 2 months has sent 91 letters to endorsers and companies. I had the unfortunate pleasure of reading all 91. For you guys, you will instead get 5 tweets that summarize them, because I think that those are basically the key points in the letters. These letters were mostly aimed at Instagram and Twitter accounts. So the first point is what I discussed earlier, this above the fold thing. If the user has to click it, you're going to get a ticket, so to speak, right? The FTC is mad at you, and they will at least write you one of these nasty grams that we were discussing earlier. The second thing is they have said that permissible hashtags to use are hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored, and hashtag your company name, and then an underscore, and then partner. If you don't have the underscore, they will be very mad at you because they'll say it's hard to read the word. But if you say your company name, so if my law firm, Debevoise and Plimpton, we'd probably have to do Debevoise underscore and underscore Plimpton underscore partner in order for them to be happy. They've explicitly rejected hashtag SP, with the SP standing for sponsored, hashtag partner standing by itself, and then just saying thanks and then the company name.
So do you get in a point with Twitter where you only have those 140 characters where all of a sudden your tweet is nothing but your sponsor tags?
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like that. So what the FTC repeatedly tells you when you're on phone calls with them when they're complaining is they say hashtag ad is 3 characters. I get that you only get 160, use hashtag ad. And it's, at least in terms of arguing with them directly, it's a little hard to cut against that. I mean, it is a very short hashtag. I think the companies that we work with tend to prefer the hashtag company underscore partner model because I think it's a little softer and a little less egregious. Yeah, go ahead. I see a question.
So if you're representing or you're a social media personality who gains a licensing agreement or your sponsorship agreement, does that create an obligation to go back and edit or modify previous history? So if you're the biggest fan of Snickers or whatever, and they sponsor you, do you have to edit your existing posts?
You do not. So the guidance there is pretty explicit on that. So if you go back to that core rule I put up in the beginning, it's if it would affect the viewer's perception of your endorsement. And if you made that endorsement before you were sponsored, there's no reason to think that that endorsement's invalid or in any way, tainted, because that was clearly just your opinion. What does get complicated is the reverse, is when you were hired 2 years ago to sponsor something and now you still want to post about that game or that product and you're not being paid for that post. And I think that's a little less clear. The FTC guidance says you should be in a situation where you no longer ever expect to get compensation from that company again, which in the gaming space is pretty complicated, right? I mean, how many games does a company have to release before you think they're not going to hire you again? I mean, you could be 4 or 5 years. I think that goes back to the FTC isn't very nuanced in this. Although I guess the good news is they haven't really gotten that far into the eSports space. They've attacked game companies, but they haven't gotten involved in eSports yet. And that may be that they recognize that eSports is complicated and still working itself out.
So on the Twitter front, given the FTC's brick-stick approach to enforcing this, if it was, so for example, people will tweet multi-part tweets. Usually it'll be in the form of a rant, but sometimes it may be in the form of an endorsement. Would each one of those tweets under FTC rules have to have its own hashtag that this is part of a series of ads?
So
it's a 5-part tweet that is all an endorsement for a product and you're telling a story or whatever. Does every single one of those 5 tweets need the hashtag ad?
So the FTC has not addressed the situation before. I suspect they would say they want that. What it would, I think, depend on is how quickly they occurred. I think if you tweeted them all out at the same time and the first one started with hashtag ad, I suspect they would probably be okay with it. Part of it depends on how likely those tweets are to be divided up. So let's say the third of the 5 tweets was retweeted a bunch, then you might have issues if it could function as a standalone tweet itself. But I would be comfortable defending if it was clearly a series, clearly denoted this is 3 of 5 and they were all sent out basically at the same time, just having the disclosure at the beginning of the first tweet.
Seems like it would break up a train of thought if you had to drop that sponsorship ad in between every tweet you were doing.
Right. Yeah. I totally. I mean, I think Twitter is a poor medium for disclosure, but nevertheless the FTC wants it, and they're going after people for it.
And the market's moving more towards Instagram than Twitter. Just from a more like a transactional point of view, Twitter's really good for like canvassing something to get people to see something very often and sort of like blanket the space to kind of like keep it in the but they say out of sight, out of mind. So you really want people to see it. It kind of is persistent. But there's a lot higher engagement rates on Instagram, and Instagram CPM is valued much more highly than it is on Twitter currently. For what it's worth.
Right. No, yeah, I don't mean to be opining on business justifications for, what works better or not. Although even in Instagram, then you run into above the fold issues. So I believe Instagram has the same 3 lines that you only see the first 3 sentences.
Well, you still need to click on the picture to then see the description because it's not going to be built into the picture that you see in the thumbnail.
Well, let's not tell the FTC that. For the moment, the FTC seems to be comfortable with the disclosure in the description, provided it's above the fold, provided it's in the first set of the description and you don't have to click a see more button. But who knows? Maybe in the future they'll want watermarks.
I mean, there's a question there about like, is that really the battle that the FTC should be going after the influencer for, or is it an Instagram thing? Because Instagram could, that's part of their system.
Sure. Well, but at the moment, they're going after mostly the sponsors themselves, and the influencers. They're not really attacking the platforms themselves.
And the question about Snickers from earlier, it's just that in esports, there's usually very specific asks and deliverables. So it's not like your existence is sponsored by Snickers, but they're usually doing something specific for a sponsor on an individual level. So to the extent that they would have to go back, like you said, we rarely would see that. I mean, there are some instances of people being very vocal on YouTube about wanting a Wendy's sponsorship for those who are familiar with Game Grumps and Wendy's sort of like unrequited love to them. But then there was very clearly a sponsored video where they brought in Aaron from Game Grumps to like their test kitchen to try new burgers. And I think that might be an interesting discussion on that point. But
right. Well, no, I think you see a lot of situations nowadays where they bring someone in and they sponsor a trip. And that's compensation, right? If you're flying someone out and putting them up in a hotel for 3 days, that's compensation. And so then marketing associated with that, if it appears to not be an advertisement, needs to be disclosed. I guess I'll caution against going too far. If you create a video out of that visit and then Wendy's posts that video, Wendy's doesn't need to do these disclosures. Everyone knows when what Wendy's posts on Wendy's Twitter account or Wendy's YouTube page is by Wendy's. It's if the influencer themselves would post about that.
Right.
And I guess I'll just do a plug in terms of how serious this can be. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Fire Festival, the massive disaster, but the class actions bar has caught on to this as well, and we're starting to see class action lawsuits against both the sponsoring companies, but also the influencers themselves. So particularly in esports, where you want to keep your players out of trouble, this matters for them too. So one thing I want to talk about, which is a rule that the FTC has an existence for television advertising that I think in the esports context really butts heads with their influencer rules. And that's what I refer to as the celebrity rule. I don't know if it has a formal name, but you have up there the text from the regulation. And it's when an endorser who appears in a television commercial is not known to a significant portion of the viewing public, then the advertiser should clearly and conspicuously disclose either the payment or the promise of compensation. The inverse of that is that when you have someone who appears who is known to a significant portion of the viewing public, you don't need to make a disclosure. So that means that when Stephen Curry does any sort of advertisement or wears a particular brand of shoes when he plays basketball, he doesn't have to have a disclosure about that. People assume that really famous people are using products and endorsing products because they're paid to do so.
Question for you on that. Is there any part of that because it's a television commercial? There's a traditional broadcasting question I think that's implicated here.
Right. So I agree, and I do think that's a relevant difference. But at the same time, I think esports can do a lot of things that signal that it's advertising, right? When you are seeing a competition at one of these big sold-out arenas, right, they're there to make money, right? And just as when you see the Hertz advertisement at the baseball stadium, you assume it's advertising. When you see the HyperX logo at the competition, one might naturally think that you would assume that's advertising, although I don't think the FTC has got in there yet.
So I think there's also a question here about, like, there are plenty of people I see in TV commercials that I have no idea who they are. And I think that there's maybe the FTC, if you're watching this, hello, I don't mean this too meanly, but like, I think most people don't know who the hell someone is when they see them on TV. I think there is a societal default that if someone is seen on television, they're being paid to be there. I mean, I doubt that you're going to be on TV shilling a product unless it's at like 2 a.m. on like the home shopping network. In which case, I don't see many disclosures on that at all either. I think there's something
right. No, I agree.
That. So I think there's a question about traditional media broadcast that's going to be different from this sort of new digital streaming broadcast that the FTC is not quite grappled with in this rule, which is someone could be very, very well known in the esports space, but because they're not in a, quote, television commercial, but that they are in a YouTube TV ad or they're on Instagram or Twitter, then they need to do it anyways. I think that there's something inherent about this television aspect to this rule that is probably maybe, in my mind, almost more relevant than how famous somebody is.
Sure, I
think there's a strange kind of convergence there where when you're watching television, there's a much brighter line between what's a commercial and what's the actual program that you're watching, with the exception of TBS having the in-program ads on the bottom of the TV. But in esports, I feel like there's a blurring of that where if someone's streaming for 6 given hours, there might be endorsements of products that they are paid to use, but it's so thoroughly integrated in what they're doing anyway. It's the kind of thing where it blends into the background. So I can kind of see both sides where, on the one hand, just because someone is using an Acer monitor in their Twitch stream out of their basement, that doesn't necessarily mean Acer paid them to use it. Or on the other hand, I think that as consumers of esports get more and more informed about endorsement, it becomes more and more popular. People might begin to make that leap that maybe he was endorsed by that, even though he wasn't.
Yeah, but I also think that there's this. We are so accustomed, and now there's not really a question of how we should perceive what we see in broadcast television sometimes. I don't see Rydell making a hashtag sponsored every time the NCAA plays. I mean, I don't see Gatorade making a disclosure every time you see the bench at a basketball game where they show the guys drinking Gatorade. Or like when someone gets splashed with Gatorade at the end of a game on baseball. I mean, you kind of take this as almost like we just assume this is part of what we expect now. But when you don't have that disclosure in the new sort of streaming space, now it's a problem all of a sudden. I mean, so I think that there's got to be a conversation about this.
I think part of the point you're also addressing is it's still a relatively new medium, despite the rapid growth of the field the last 4 or 5 years.
Right.
I think you're absolutely correct that FTC, listening in, I won't apologize for this remark. They have absolutely no idea how to handle streaming at this point. And I think it's kind of the very same thing when you were talking about people watch football. Why would I put money into watching? I don't understand that.
Right.
I think it's the same thing with the FTC right now. Right now, we've grown cynical enough that anyone who appears on TV is absolutely paid to be there. There's no exceptions, and we're shocked when it's the opposite. And I think there needs to become. I think what you're waiting on is you're waiting for a societal shift when the FTC wakes up one day and goes, "Everyone on the internet is paid to be there." The exception is when they're not.
Well, yeah.
It's going to be a dark day.
I mean, this is maybe a cynical way of looking at it, or even dystopian, but you could make the argument that anybody on YouTube is paid to be there by Google. Because otherwise they wouldn't consistently be on YouTube if they weren't being paid for the ad revenue. So, I mean, I think that there's certainly a very... You're right. You're right to kind of maybe distill it down to something succinct and say that we butt heads on it. Because you're right. When you go to someone like Steph Curry, okay, it's very clearly he's a celebrity. And even if you don't know basketball, you've probably seen him in the window of your Nike store or Adidas or something like that.
So yeah, I mean, I will actually steal an example from Jason here. I think where it differs is that, you used to have people playing basketball in their backyards. You used to have Michael Jordan playing basketball on television. You never had Michael Jordan playing basketball in his backyard with a basketball he was paid to play with in his backyard, right? And I think that's where the YouTube issue comes in. Right. Whereas I assume when someone is just playing basketball in their backyard, they're not being paid to sponsor anything. I assume when I see Michael Jordan that he's being paid to wear everything he's wearing or owns it himself, right? In the case of like Air Jordans. If I go online and I see a video of someone who might be famous if I'm really into eSports, but this is the first video I watch, and it looks like they're just playing in their basement, which some of these team houses look like, maybe it's a little unclear. So I don't think the FTC is wrong to try and make clear to consumers. I do hope consumers understand.
I'll object just on the basis that the vast majority of my clients do not play in a basement. That's a stereotype I'd like to squash almost immediately.
In an attic?
Maybe one of them, but he's been told it looks like a sauna. So, I mean...
It's a loft. It's not.
He is in Europe, so... but it's... There's certainly something to be said about streaming, the rights to a broadcast or the rights to a stream, because you're right to bring that up, and we discussed that earlier, because I think that is apt, that you're not going to see that example in traditional sports. But you also... Nobody owns the rights to the existence of the game of basketball. Nobody owns the rights to the existence of the game of football. The terms of service and the end-user license agreement that you sign when you download the client for League of Legends and you play League of Legends has a very clear statement in it that says that anything you do in the game is owned by Riot Games. Nothing you do in that client, in that game, will ever be your property. So somebody who has built their career on streaming their personality, on their reactions or their educational, informative side of how to approach the game, all of that, none of that, I mean, I think we have yet to see any kind of legal discussion about is that sufficiently transformative to actually separate the intellectual property rights away from the publisher and the developer and actually give ownership to the creator in that sense, even though people are tuning in to watch that person. They're not tuning in to watch League of Legends. They're watching that person play League of Legends. And so that's not an argument, that's not a problem traditional sports have ever had to overcome as a hurdle. And so when you're talking about sponsorship and disclosures and the relationship the developers and publishers play into it, it can get complicated very quickly in the esports space. But
Sure, no, that's fine. And maybe we should jump to our question slide here. Although I don't want to miss Michael Jordan versus Faker. If you want to tell me the first.
So there's really the first question on here: when, if ever, are esport players celebrities? So let's talk real quick about two. It's an unfair comparison, right? Michael Jordan has said that he had a very controversial statement on social media where he said he has set a. Like the height of the sport is a ceiling. It's a hard ceiling that he set. That no one can ever play better than him. And he's almost kind of like the iconic go-to of like the biggest celebrity in traditional sports in some extent. So he's new to social media, but he has 3.2 million Twitter followers. He's new to Instagram, but has 12 million Instagram followers. And if you look at some of his posts, it's not going to really be much different than what you see an esports player doing. The issues presented to someone like Michael Jordan are going to be the same issues presented to an esports athlete. But his highest contract is $33.1 million. But he made more money in sponsorships in 2014 than he made in all of his contracts combined when he played. So the issue of sponsorship is actually a huge monetary kind of question there. Faker is probably the closest to the Michael Jordan of esports right now. He's won 3 world championships with SKT1. He has rumored to have the highest contract. I think it's sort of sitting somewhere around 2.5 million, if the accuracy is thereabouts correct, to be playing for this year. He has $1 million in total prize earnings, so he's probably one of the highest earning players currently playing in League of Legends. There are some Dota 2 players that have made more, just because the prize money in Dota 2 is different and a little higher. But looking at his stats, his Twitter doesn't hold up to Michael Jordan. His Instagram doesn't hold up to Michael Jordan. But what does blow Michael Jordan out of the water is when this kid turns on his computer, he fills up the United Center twice over every day. Let that sink in. 42,000 people will sit at their computers and watch him play a video game or watch him do whatever he does while his computer's on and his stream is on. Every day, concurrently, at the same time. The very first time he turned on his Twitch stream, when he transferred over from Azubu, which had an exclusive agreement with SKT1, when they got free from that Azubu deal and he came to Twitch, I think 250,000 people watched him simultaneously the first time he streamed on Twitch.
And what was he doing? Was he just playing a game?
Yeah, he's just playing. No, he's
Oh.
playing League of Legends. He's just playing League of Legends. Plus, there's obligations in some of these guys' contract to play the video game and not stream them checking their email. But there's something to be said that if Michael Jordan were to open up a Twitch stream, like maybe he'd get like 100 people, because maybe he doesn't know how to get people to be interested in it. Maybe his content's not all that great. He might not be set up to stream in his backyard with the basketball that he's paid to play with. So I think the vast majority of people who are in esports know of Faker. They know of Arteezy and Dota. They're going to know of some really big names in the game that they pay attention to. So they are celebrities in their own right within the context of this small, as you pointed out, sir, new field. But I think he's definitely arguably a celebrity. But whether the FTC considers that, well, let's go back to the statement, whether they are known to a significant portion of the viewing public, well, the people who are viewing this stuff know him. The problem is the FTC, I think, is looking at the vast majority of people who aren't viewing this as being the relevant public to the question.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we have a bunch of other questions here related to social media. I've touched on some of them through questions. It looks like we have about 8 minutes left, so I'm happy to just run my mouth about this. But if people have questions, maybe about anything in esports and the law, I want to give you guys an opportunity to voice them now before we continue on.
I thought we saw a question somewhere back. Yeah.
I didn't have one before. Any thoughts on the developments for Lee yesterday?
Plenty of
So
thoughts.
if you didn't hear that, the question was, are there any new developments with League from yesterday?
Yeah,
So
well,
what happened yesterday, first of all, for those who don't know?
So there were some pretty big announcements. The developments I think are yet to be seen. They have to activate or actually put them into practice. League has announced, or at least Riot Games has announced, that their League of Legends professional scene, which is called the LCS, is going to be adopting a franchise model for the organizations that are currently in the LCS. This is a massive shift away from the relegation model that is very similar to what we see in like the British Premier League for football. So instead of, so there's a shift there, right? And then there's also been this sort of dovetail to that, this like footnote in the announcement that they say that they're going to want to put together a players association. So there's a lot of thoughts about that, and I could probably talk about another hour on that alone. But real quickly, I think that any player association that's going to be involved in any aspect of esports needs to be looking out for the players. And I don't think that you should be bringing in people outside of the esports space who have no experience with esports, who have no connection to the actual players themselves, and then being forced into an election by players to have to either sign on or potentially risk the wrath of Riot by not approving their pre-selected names, a question of whether or not those people should be in fact representing the players. mean, whose interests are they going to be really standing for? I think there's a really big discussion that I think needs to be happening about like what the right setup for that's going to look like, who's best to represent those players, and are they ready for it? So once you get a players association in one sport, what happens to the next sport? So if the league guys get some special agreement with, Riot Games because of their player association, and they live in the same house as the Dota 2 guys or the CSGO guys for the same organization, you now have a very big potential headache because that's not what the Bears have to do. They own one team. It's an NFL team. So they're part of the NFL Players Association. So they can easily say, well, okay, the basketball guys get that. Why don't we get that? And the Bears can say, because we're a football team. Go talk to the Bulls if you have a problem with it. That's not the case in esports. You have organizations that own multiple teams across multiple sports. So I think that there's some logistical hurdles that we're going to have to overcome internally as well to put it actively into practice in the best way.
So, and I guess I'd say I broadly favor this announcement. I think, Jason mentioned earlier, you have publishers who own the copyright to the games, and I think by having them directly involved, it reduces the risk of legal issues down the road. I guess I'm broadly pretty happy with how we've seen esports evolved, which is I think, right now it's kind of chaos and a bunch of people trying a bunch of different things. And the hope is that as the publishers get more involved, they'll adopt good best practices and get rid of bad practices. And we'll have, a formal, well-run league for these different games.
There's no doubt that over the last couple of years, at least 3 to 4 years ago, the developers and publishers needed to do more to protect the players that were pretty much the lifeblood of esports. And for them, esports has been a substantially, successful endeavor. So they really owe it to these kids who are putting their lives and careers on hold potentially to try and make a real go in the sport. So this is a step in the right direction, but as an advocate for players, I'm never going to feel like they've done enough, and I certainly feel like this might be maybe about time that they're doing something, but that doesn't absolve all of the other issues that kind of surround it.
So with like Twitch, like as they reveal or they do more with like IRL, like for everybody who doesn't know, Twitch is usually like just people playing video games and you see the people's screens and what they're playing, but then now they have IRL and it's like just people going around broadcasting from wherever they are, like Periscope.
Yeah, IRL is short for in real life.
But anyway, sorry for the nomenclature. But so I guess my question is, do the same rules apply for the FTC? Is like how do they have to, like if I'm going to a restaurant as like an IRL streamer, do I have to be like, oh, I'm paid by this restaurant to be here? Or like, is their day-to-day activity monetized like that? And is that like an issue that comes up?
I would be shocked if you had a visionary restaurant owner actually jump on board for that to try and get as like a marketing tool. That'd be really cool if they did.
Why not? I could see it. If someone was a really famous Yelp reviewer and now they're taking a camera along with them to Twitch stream all of their reviews of restaurants, I could see where the FTC could say that's an endorsement that might require some kind of sponsorship.
Oh, I wouldn't be shocked that someone would potentially see that as an endorsement. I would be shocked to find a restaurant owner be visionary enough to embrace that and actually see that as something they'd be willing to sponsor someone.
But to answer your question, the answer is yes, absolutely. You would have to disclose that. I don't even think that's a close call. I think if you're paid to go to someone's restaurant and live stream while you're there, you got to disclose that.
Absolutely.
And in fact, the FTC would like you to disclose that multiple times throughout the live stream if people can pop in and out. So the FTC has told us that if you have a live stream, you have to disclose periodically and not told anyone what periodically means. So, for the moment, maybe once an hour works. But it's yet to be determined what periodically even means, but definitely more than just once.
I think we're going to get to that point where it's like weather on the radio. It's every, on the 8s, every 8 days.
Yeah, I think it'll depend how quickly people pop in and out. So I think if you think about like the final round for, League of Legends World Championships, any disclosures there, if they have to make them at all, would probably be just once because people are going to tune in for the whole time. If it's something more like Twitch where people are popping in and out, right, I think it depends how quickly the average user stays. If the average user stays for an hour, then once an hour sounds good. If the average user stays for 8 minutes, then I guess it's on the 8s.
Yeah. But just as a great example of something that you would, because it depends on the type of sponsorship. Because if they're just passively using said sponsored product, then you would need to kind of do that. But if they were to sort of lump it into one sponsored moment, there's an example of a talent that we've worked with that is like, they say, they enter sellout mode. They actually fake, After Effects productions, and there's like a disco ball that's not actually there, and they put on glasses and it's like labeled sellout mode, and they start like selling out, and they go through this like brief 10-minute thing where they just start hawking their sponsors, and the sponsors actually like it because that's part of their branding and the attitude and the persona of that person. But then once they exit that, they're not still using the product passively. So I
Sounds
think
like the
there's-
scene in Wayne's World where they're busting out every possible sponsorship they could find.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Cool. Well, I think we're actually at time, so I think that's going to do us for now. So thank
Awesome.
you for
Thanks for
listening to us
coming
talk
out.
about esports. And we're going to be back in 10 minutes to talk about legal basics for game developers.